Hello and welcome to the AVForums CES podcast special for Wednesday the 13th of January, and I'm trying to keep myself cheery and upbeat while suffering from jet lag and being completely and utterly tired. I was going to say something else there. Assistant Editor Steve Withers, are you with us?
I am indeed, yes, I am indeed, Phil. Just about in body, if not entirely in spirit.
Yeah, well, you weren't there last week either. Right, film quote time. Assistant Editor Steve Withers.
Sorry, boss, but there's only two men I trust. One of them's me, and the other's not you.
News Editor Mark Hodgkinson.
The last Mohican is burning, man.
And Audio Reviewer Ed Selley.
On any other day, that might seem strange.
Yeah. So some strange things, but more of that as we go on. So yes, we got back yesterday, and it was a long week, as these things normally are at CES. But I've got to say, Steve, for the first time in, still not sure if it's 9 or 10 years. We're still arguing about that point. But if you're 6th year, at least we knew that. A lot of these shows, they tend to run into one in each other when you think back to them, because there isn't anything that really outstanding apart from, I can remember my first year, it was HD DVD versus Blu-ray. We actually discussed that with one of the members of the BDA, and I had a bit of a giggle about how that all transpired back in 2008. But I guess this is the first show really since then where we have had genuine new technology officially now on the market. So, 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray did make it to market. It was announced. Bit strange that there was only three manufacturers announcing players, although one of them won't see light of day in the UK because it's the US arm of Philips, as I understand it, Steve. So really, as far as we're concerned, there's two players announced for the market. Some big players. When I say big players, I mean manufacturers not announcing anything, which we were a bit surprised about. I mean, Sony, one of the spearheads of the BDA and behind Blu-ray, has not committed anything towards Ultra HD Blu-ray, and this is one consumer electronics company that owns a studio who do not seem to be backing this format in any way whatsoever at this moment in time. So as far as that format is concerned, it has had its launch. I'm sure we'll get more as the year goes on, but technically even the launch players are missing some big features. Most notably, the Samsung or the Panasonic will not be able to do Dolby Vision, which seems rather surprising, but I guess they didn't want to hold up the launch just so they would be compatible.
Chipset, aren't they? And I guess
is it chipset, not software?
I believe it's a chipset rather than a software issue, which is why they don't have it. And I guess they didn't want to, if they delayed until, say, the autumn or even into Christmas whilst waiting on something like that, I think that's just going to kill the format dead. They had to get something in the shops as they originally intended by spring, which is why they could have announced one.
They could have announced one and said it's coming.
Yeah,
they could have at least done that.
Well, look at it this way, right? You've already got Sony and LG, because if you think about who's going to make players, okay, there's only going to be Panasonic, Samsung, Sony, LG, okay, Philips possibly, but those are the four big manufacturers of players, and there's going to be the smaller manufacturers like Oppo, who maybe will do something at a later date, but they're not going to be in the first wave. So out of the first four, we've got two who are basically sitting on the fence. LG and Sony, from what we've heard, Phil, are basically saying we're waiting to see how things pan out.
Exactly. It's not chipset, because I asked that direct question of somebody
who
I will not name, but they were specifically at, are you delaying because chipset? And it was, no, we're delaying because we're not sure this is the future and we want to see how it's going to develop, because their view was that they were more interested in an HDD delivery system, a media box with a large hard drive capacity, was what they were looking at rather than a disc format.
Although it's also possible that another reason for not launching now is because they are waiting on Dolby Vision chipsets, because after all, LG, for example, obviously, as we'll talk about later in more detail, but they are supporting it on their OLED TV. So, if you wanted to do a player that did do that in order to tie it in with your product range, that would make sense. But it was a little bit strange that Sony, of all people, who developed Blu-ray in the first place, are basically saying, we're not sure about it, we're going to sit on the fence.
Yeah, but the thing with Sony is, and obviously we'll discuss it when we come on to TVs, but the whole thing that I got with them, apart from the 4,000 nit demonstration that they were doing, which was impressive, it's more of the same. It was almost a case of we don't really know what we're doing. We don't.
TV seems more of a sideline to audio now. They seem to be going more that way. Certainly, the presentation was geared that way.
I mean, they had two models, Mark, on the stand that they were showing off. The same for Panasonic. Panasonic only had two TVs on their stand. And literally, physically, 2 TVs.
Literally.
Whereas Sony they might have 2 models, but they had about 15 set up on the stand of each. There were 2 TVs on the Panasonic stand, the OLED and the DX900. I mean, the DX900, I don't even think is slated for a US release yet. We're getting it in the next month or so in Europe. And as far as I'm aware, it's not coming to the US at this moment in time.
I think the only TV that they announced for the US was the CX950, right? Oh, sorry, not CX, CZ950.
Yep.
That was announced for the US. Obviously, it's the one we've already had and reviewed here in Europe towards the end of last year. They announced the DX900 for release in Europe. And that was it, wasn't it? As far as, obviously we'll find out more about the European lineup at the European convention at the end of February. But in terms of the US, and Phil, do you want to tell a story about going into Fry's?
Yeah, well, I mean, it could be that like it happens in the UK where we have the convention and then we're told about the UK lines of TVs and so on, because none of that was on show at CES. There's literally 2 TVs. We don't know till February what we're getting in Europe and the UK. Now, it could be that the US is exactly the same and they're just waiting to finalise their product line, see what the see what the big retail chains want to carry, and then come up with their lineup of TVs. However, we happened to be in a really big Best Buy store. First day we were there. And then the last day of the trip, it seems to be a tradition with us now, Steve, that we go to Fry's, which is another massive consumer electronics store. Massive. I mean, this is like 2 warehouses full. I mean, it's massive. And they cover everything. And the TV section is massive. They have a full theatre, like a full home theatre that sits about 20 people, where they can demonstrate projectors and speakers and so on. They also have 2-channel rooms and all that kind of thing. I mean, if you think of it, they sell it and it's there and it's on display. Both of these stores, I mean, Best Buy is massive. It's like our Curry's equivalent to that in the US. None of those 2 stores had any Panasonic product in terms of TVs on display.
No,
they had LG, they had Samsung, they had some Sony, and they had some cheaper brands, which in the US is RCA and Sharp, which is now owned by Hisense. And that was it.
Yeah, Vizio, didn't they, as well?
Vizio, yeah.
Yeah, but not a single Panasonic.
No Panasonics at all.
Interesting.
And then speaking to someone on their stand, again, someone who we will not disclose their name or so on, but they did speak to us and more or less confirmed that the only business that Panasonic has in terms of TVs in the US is online. Stores are just not taking their product for
right, because
reason.
they're too expensive, or have been too expensive.
Don't know, Mark.
No, I don't know why.
And this is, I mean, obviously we're not saying anything here. We're just reporting what we found and what we've heard and what we've been told. We're not saying anything specific here, and we're not saying it's going a certain way. It could be that they're just waiting, like we say, for them to finalise what they're going to do for their lineup and then announce their lineup for the US. We just found it really strange because
normally they announce the US lineup at CES for obvious reasons. I mean, it is still, although it's an international show, it is still largely US centric. So the fact they didn't announce a US lineup at CES is unusual, to say the least.
And you just have to look at the TV market in the US. I mean, it's far worse than it is in the UK. I mean, in the UK we are seeing that fight to the bottom in terms of pricing and so on, and we've seen brands like Sharp and Toshiba disappear over the last 12 months. The US market is far more competitive. They are at the bottom. There's no more fighting to be done. They really are at a stage now where it appears that there is no margin at all in the TV market. It's why you see brands like Sharp and so on being bought up by Chinese companies like Hisense. Completely different market to the US, to the UK. But you can just see, looking at that and then looking at what's actually available in the stores. And I mean, the vast majority of the TVs in the stores were Samsung and LG models.
Yeah, and particularly it seemed LG had a really big foothold in, certainly in the Fry's superstore. Had loads and loads of LG TVs in there. But one manufacturer described the US market basically as people just interested in the biggest and cheapest TVs that they can sling in the back of their pickup truck, and that's the US market for you now. It's not about quality as much as it is about size and price. And
I don't know why you're
and that's
limiting
never,
that to TVs.
no, well, no, true. That's probably everything in the US, but certainly that's never been Panasonic's strong point. They've always prided themselves on a quality product. Maybe a little bit more expensive, but also high quality and delivering real picture performance. And if that's not of interest to a consumer, that does make it difficult for you to sell your TV when you're competing against other manufacturers who really are just pushing out big cheap tellies.
I've found it strange over the last few years that certainly that's been the case when we're speaking to people. They have said, look, there's more margin for us in the UK, there's more margin for us in Europe because there's still an appreciation for quality. And I always thought, well, that's a bit strange because the US market's massive. They must also be interested in luxury models or higher models that have more performance and so on, but seemingly not. It really is something that market's just not interested in when it comes to
at least
TV.
it explains why we've been getting, if you think about it, why we got the CZ952 before the US and why we're getting the DX900 before anywhere else.
Yeah, there's still an appetite, there's still a market for it. That's not to say that there isn't a really big enthusiast market in the US, but obviously it doesn't pay. Or you have these companies who are obviously reassessing.
Or maybe in the US, when they go high end and big screen, they actually go projector. Perhaps it's more of a market for that there than there is. Because I guess they got the space for it, haven't they, in the States? Whereas in the UK, putting a projector into your lounge may be difficult, but putting a large screen TV in might be more of an option. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why the US enthusiast market is more projector orientated than it is
maybe
TV. But that's just speculation on
yeah, it was interesting, but I found that's quite surprising, and to see it with your own eyes and actually go into these two places. I mean, these are the biggest electronics retailers in the US, Fry's and Best Buy, so that was quite interesting and a bit of an eye-opener. Anyway, so let's move on. So let's stick with Panasonic then. We've started talking about them, so we'll stick with them just for the time being. So the DX900, this was a TV which I saw a pre-production model of it. I'm trying to remember now. I think it was back in June or maybe early July. I saw a pre-production version of this TV, and Panasonic were looking for input, not just from ourselves at AVForums and our readers, but a bit of a wider audience to try and build an LED LCD TV the best that it could be, and look at ways in which to improve the performance in areas where LCD is technically not as strong because of the way that the technology works, and because there are inherent flaws with how that technology works, and the main one being the backlight, being the way that the panel is lit from the back. And there's been all sorts of different developments. So we've got VA panels, you have IPS panels, you have different ways in which to block the light and so on. You have edge lit, and you also have full array LED backlights as well. So with all these different technologies, Panasonic have basically come up with a new backlight system for the DX900, and this is the major development in terms of what they are doing. And basically it's a honeycomb system, so it's 512 areas of the backlight. Now these areas are they're actually enclosed with the LEDs inside them, so there's no light leak. They've tried very, very hard to get away from any clouding or any uniformity issues with the backlight. And I have to say, they were not scared in demonstrating this technology, because they had fireworks against them at night, so obviously black background, really bright highlights, because it's an HDR set as well. Now there was a tiny bit of haloing, but we're talking about a tiny bit, with real torture material. And it was great to see them really torturing the set as well, to try and demonstrate how much work has actually gone into this backlight, because it was gobsmackingly impressive, wasn't it, Steve?
Yeah, it was. They really worked hard in terms of delivering the kind of the deep blacks you'd expect from an OLED, but with also the brighter image that you can get out of an LCD panel. And I hadn't seen it until we saw the demo on, I think it was last Tuesday, and I was really impressed with it. The dynamic range was amazing, and like you said, there was only a very tiny amount of haloing on very difficult material that you wouldn't normally be watching. But I mean, it was brave of them, and I credit them for doing that, to actually be prepared to put on some challenging material on the TV to show its capabilities. And also they had it up against an OLED studio monitor as well, in terms of its color accuracy. Again, it was really impressive.
That's what really impressed me, because obviously I did the trip with them last year as well to Technics and so on, and they were demonstrating this set as well as the OLED, which was going to get announced to IFA, and showing us against the monitor. And yes, they had certain things that looked really nice back then, but in terms of actually nailing the white balance and the color, there was still slight differences there. But when we saw that on last Tuesday, they've nailed it. It looked, and you got to remember that even though it's an 11-inch OLED professional reference monitor, it's $35,000 to buy one of these things up against a TV which will be likely 1/10 of that price, and they looked almost identical in terms of color,
and very similar in terms of black levels too. I mean, the OLED obviously had the edge, but I was very impressed. I mean, I prefer, as a rule, I would prefer OLED to LED. I've never been a particularly big fan of LED LCD television as a technology. I think it's got its limitations, but they were squeezing a fantastic image out of that TV.
And they'll be the first. They will be the first to put their hands up and say, "Look, LED LCD TV." It has its drawbacks. It has its flaws because of the inherent nature of the technology and the way the technology works. But and they said it's been a fight, developing this TV, trying to get around those issues and trying to negate as much as they can in terms of picture performance the flaws that are sometimes seen in a LED LCD TV. And they had it up against another TV. I'm not going to I'll show some respect to Panasonic and not say exactly what model it was, but it looked very similar to a Samsung GS9500, although I'm not saying that was the TV which it was being shown against. It just looked like one. And when you looked at the backlight and the way that the fireworks were working, the differences were unbelievable. It was real torture material. And let's face it, the TV that looked like a GS9500, that is one hell of a TV when it comes to LED LCD TVs. It's one of the better performing of recent memory, and it was eating it for dinner. It was making mincemeat out of the backlight on it. So I mean, we're not trying to hype it up. We can only report on what we saw, but majorly impressive, and hopefully we'll be getting one in soon. And they were keen for us to get one in soon, so we can test it with our material in our surroundings and come to our own conclusions on it. But again, Panasonic putting their neck on the line and saying, look, flaws, all the rest of it, but we're trying to make the best that we can, and what we've seen so far, and we're not trying to hype it up, but on what we've seen so far, really impressive. Yeah,
it's not often I sit there thinking, normally I wouldn't be sitting there thinking like I could happily have that in the lounge, but I was thinking that would look awesome in the lounge, and I'd be more than happy to have that TV as my TV. It looked that good. And I think the good news is generally I think it'll be arriving a lot sooner than anyone expects.
Yeah, any indication of price?
Yeah, we know how much it's going to cost roughly.
You can't say.
But I think we were pleasantly surprised.
Cool.
And unfortunately, sometimes we get to see these things ahead of time, and I'm sure the listeners understand this, that there are certain things that the manufacturer wants to keep to themselves until a certain date. There's nothing underhand in that. It's just that they'll give us a look at stuff on the understanding that we don't talk about specifics until a certain date, and we're happy to do that. What they don't do is they don't say you will give it this opinion or that opinion. It's completely our own opinion. It's just that you're not allowed to say anything until a certain time, which we're more than happy to do because we understand the commercial implications of that. But it's always nice to get an early look, and it's always nice that companies take on board what we think in terms of reviews, but also what the forum members are writing on the forums and the owners' threads and so on. These companies do read those threads and do pick up on what's being said, and if they can get that into products, then it's always nice to know that kind of feedback is going on. And we know for a fact that Panasonic, they knew the comments under the videos before we did because they'd been there and reading them before we'd had a chance to be in there and read them. So they are interested in what the forum members think of the new tech and what's coming to market. So, and impressive stuff from Panasonic again. And obviously they've got their Blu-ray player. Like we say, it doesn't do Dolby Vision, but apart from that, it does absolutely everything else, Steve. They've come to market with a real impact, and I guess they are thinking as well, if you're going to be first out the gates, we may as well make this a real high-end product, something that's going to give the format a nice launch in terms of video but also audio.
Yeah, it's always tricky, isn't it? Because you think, well, if you're launching a new format, there's two ways to go. One is to go for a cheap player to get people to buy it, which is kind of the approach that Samsung are taking, or you go for the sort of the more high-end player that makes it a real quality piece of equipment that you can buy and put in your system, and that's kind of more the approach Panasonic are taking. So it's, it incorporates everything that Ultra HD Blu-ray is supposed to do, apart from Dolby Vision. And also, it's got very high-end audio performance as well. It's got 7.1 channel outputs. It's THX certified. Two twin HDMI outputs, one for audio, one for video, which is great if you don't have a don't have an AVR that can pass HDCP 2.2 or HDMI 2.0A. And the absence of Dolby Vision, I don't think is necessarily a big issue, because don't forget they're matching it with their TV, which is HDR10 and also THX certified.
I think this is the important point to get across. Dolby Vision is an add-on to the Blu-ray format. So if you are buying a UHD Blu-ray player and UHD Blu-ray discs, the easiest way to explain this is that every Blu-ray disc, UHD Blu-ray disc, and every UHD Blu-ray player will, as a minimum, play back HDR10, which is fantastic quality as it is. Dolby Vision is an add-on. It's an optional extra to have on top, and it has metadata, and it does a few additional things. It brings out a little bit more in the highlights and so on. You should not feel that you are missing out if you buy a UHD Blu-ray and you only play back the HDR10 layer. You're getting a hell of a performance from that. It's just that Dolby add-on, slight differences, and their stuff, I think Steve is mastered slightly different, but it's nothing to get your knickers in a twist about, really.
No, not at all. You're still going to get an amazing performance. I mean, we've seen loads and loads of demos now over the last week, and I can tell you that are absolutely blown away by some of the stuff that we've seen in terms of the potential. I mean, I honestly think that my first show was that the year that 3D was first being launched, and it would make a big deal of it. It wasn't really a big thing, and since then, most of the shows have been haven't been that special. But this time, we're talking about changes that are happening now that are going to affect the way we watch television for the next decade. So this is fundamental changes in TV technology and TV standards. And therefore, this is probably the most important show that we've been to since the launch of high definition, basically. It's really important. And seeing the potential and seeing what is coming as well, not just what we can get now this year, but also what will be coming in a few years' time down the line. Really exciting in terms of the kind of performance you're going to get out of a TV.
It's not just hype and marketing.
No.
There is actually a performance benefit behind this stuff. And, we were skeptical going into this whole HDR future because you're talking about 1,000 nits or 4,000 nits or 10,000 nits. 1,000 nits, if your whole screen was 1,000 nits, that's enough to blind you. That would be enough to blind you. But that's not what it's all about. It's about the spectral highlights. It's about a white being on screen on a very small part of the screen, or an explosion on the screen where for a very short amount of time you get a really bright image. It's comfortable to watch HDR. HDR material is comfortable to watch. It's not going to tire you out. It's just that it brings out the highlights and stuff, and it's really difficult to put it into words and to explain it in reviews and that kind of thing, because it is one of those technologies that you get it as soon as you see it. As soon as you see it done properly. And I haven't seen any bad examples. The only bad example I saw of HDR was a Netflix logo at a Panasonic convention last year in Frankfurt.
Yeah.
We were both standing there and we were both turned away in pain when that came on because it was super bright. They've learnt the lesson from that. That's no longer going to be an issue. I haven't seen any badly done HDR material. It's all been done respectfully to the material. It's done in a way which brings out things that it really made sense to me when we saw the beginning of Man of Steel, when that battle's going on at the start. Yeah. And there's laser weapons and stuff going off, and they're really bright, and there's flames, and that's really quite bright and highlighted, and you see detail within that which you would be missing otherwise. But it was the explosions. And there was one explosion in particular that just for that split second, you were getting the full brightness on screen of what it's capable of doing. And it just added that realism to the explosion. It's what would happen if something did explode in front of you. You would look away, or it would shock you at the brightness. And that's telling the story. That's helping move the narrative along, and it's putting you in the action. And that's when it really made sense to me that this is a game changer. It's going to be, and like good 3D, it's going to be subtle most of the time. It's going to be subtly done. It's going to bring out highlights. It's going to bring out details, especially in the dark areas. Where TVs have really suffered, and where LCD TV in particular has really suffered, is in shadow details. and bringing out the lower reaches of the image. This is where HDR makes a big difference. Because you've got that wider dynamic range, you can bring out more in the shadows. The way that we're going to have to calibrate the TVs, it's 70% of most of the adjustments that's going to be made is going to be made in the lower reaches of the image, which surprised me. But that's how much control you're going to have when it comes to grayscale, when it comes to bringing detail out in images. It's going to be that, that lower spectrum, that lower area of the image, where when you're thinking about HDR, the first thing that people think about, because the discussion is about nits and about brightness, is the highlights. But it's equally more to do with the lower area of the image. Something which I think a lot of commentators have missed when it comes to describing the technology, and certainly the stuff that I've seen coming from the show from other outlets. It's all about the brightness, but actually it's not all about the brightness. It's about bringing detail out in the image. It's about just having a more natural image. I mean, one of the demo materials was a woman sat in sunlight with shadow, and she was wearing I forget the name of the clothing now.
Wearing a kimono.
Kimono, that's all. I couldn't think of the word there. It just got out of my head. And it was nothing spectacular. It was just her sitting there in the sunlight and in the shadow, but the amount of detail that was brought, because there was the SDR version next to it. The SDR version looked terrible in comparison. Once you see HDR, and this is a story that we kept getting told, and even creatives had been saying, one thing that we were at on the Tuesday evening, talking about, it was the cinematographer for Marco Polo, and he was talking about, his favourite use of the technology and so on, and it was nothing to do with the highlights. It was about what you could bring out in the image, in the darker areas of the image.
For the first time using natural light at night time and that sort of stuff, which you couldn't do before, just enough latitude before.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, at Marco Polo, it's set in a time period where there was no electricity, there was no, there was the only lighting you had was sunlight or candlelight, and for the first time ever, he's able to light it either using sunlight or using candlelight, and he doesn't have to worry about using little tricks that is used in the film industry where you have subtle lighting here and there. So it's the first time he's able to film a scene without artificial lighting and actually light it the way it would be, and it adds more realism to the scene. So this technology is a game changer, and it's not hype and it's not marketing, because if it was me, I would like to think that myself and Steve would be the first to be asking the really difficult questions and pointing out where we think this technology would fall down and all the rest of it. And I have to say that for the first time in a long time, because 3D, we were straight away skeptical about that, even though you love the technology, Steve. We could see the drawbacks with it. You could see the drawbacks of having to wear, for example, glasses in the home. And if you're not used to wearing glasses, people don't want to sit and wear glasses and watch TV. But for the first time since that, this is a genuine technology that it's something that you're going to be able to get involved in quite easily. You're going to be able to go and buy the content or stream the content. It's not just coming on a disc format. It's going to be available via Netflix and Amazon. There's some material already on Amazon that's HDR. I think the only problem getting in the way is this whole HDR 10 versus Dolby Vision versus Technics version and all the rest of it. But I think that what this show has shown is that those issues are not big issues, because HDR 10 is used by everybody. So at least if you get anything that's HDR, whether it's a TV, whether it's a disc player, whether it's content, the bottom line is it's going to be HDR 10, and then anything else is an add-on to that.
Yeah. So you're going to get all the benefits that you'd expect from that content, not just HDR 10, not just high dynamic range, but also wider color space, 10-bit video, and obviously 4K resolution. So, that's why I was saying earlier about this is a fundamental change in the way we're going to be watching television going forward. The only thing we don't know about yet is broadcast, but certainly from the point of view of streaming and Blu-ray, we've got a very good idea now of where we're going for the next decade. And
of course, with broadcast, all you're talking about really is how the gamma works in the simplest terms. I think that's the easiest.
And frame rate's the other thing they need to decide.
So frame rate and gamma are really the things when it comes to broadcast, and that's something that I think is going to be driven on cost for anything. I think that's the one thing you're going to pick up on. Broadcasters will not pay a hell of a lot for technology, so it's going to work on cost. And on a cost basis, the BBC's developed their log gamma system. That if I was to put money on it, I think that's the one that's going to be developed, because the BBC's done all the groundwork on it and spent the money on it. So I think that will be the system that is taken on, and I think frame rates, I don't think you're going to see any higher than 120.
I think for me, you mentioned Man of Steel, and one of the great things about that demo was because it was next to another TV showing the exact same footage in SDR, it gave you a real chance to see how different it appears. And like you said, Phil, you could see so much more detail in bright and dark parts of the image than you could in the SDR version. It was quite impressive, and not just from the point of view of new content being created, like the cinematographer Marco Polo talking about, how it's freed him up basically to do things he couldn't do before. I think that as long as it's being used in a creative way, it's going to be fantastic. And going forward for new content, it's going to be a real change in terms of the way that they design and make TV shows and movies, because they have this much more freedom creatively to do that. But it can also really add to it. I mean, as long as it's done in a sensible way with the participation of the content creators or the rights holders and their families. But with older stuff, it can also add real value in terms of the image quality. And I think a lot of people were worried about just doing HDR transfers for the sake of it. But for example, at the UHD Alliance, they had a demo clip running, which was being introduced by Francis Ford Coppola. So obviously he's done HDR remasters of some of his films, and they were showing two scenes, one from the Cotton Club, which I think was made in early 80s, 84, 85, and also a sequence from the beginning of the Ride of Valkyrie sequence from Apocalypse Now, Ed. And Apocalypse Now was shot in 1976, 1977, and looking at that footage on LG OLED, it's like it was made yesterday. It was really, really impressive. The clarity, the way the light reflected off the sea as there were helicopters flying above the water, just stunning. And you think, well, they can do that. If that's there in the original negative, it's going to look amazing. So don't panic about it.
But obviously, the caveat to that is that not every film is going to lend itself to that because of the way it's shot. And there was a trend in the 70s and 80s to shoot to a certain nit value, which was 500 nits. No, it wasn't. It was 50 nits.
Depending on...
so it's going to be dependent on the material, obviously, and the stock that it was shot on, and if they have access to the original negative or so on. So, there are caveats there, and the main one is there have been a few rights holders who have said to the studio, no, we don't want an HDR version because that is our finished version.
Which is
fair enough. And if that is the call made and the studio respects that, then I think that's, as film enthusiasts, that's as far as we can push it, and that's as much as we can hope for. That they do respect the filmmaker or the family or the rights holders' decisions in that. And even if it is applied to some older films, it's not going to have the same kind of impact as a cinematographer has his hands untied now. And they can add a lot more now because they're shooting for HDR. You've got to remember that they didn't shoot for HDR. So any latitude that's there and anything that they can pull out of older films, it's not going to be as in your face. It's not going to be designed that to look that way. It's just what they're going to be able to pull from that older film and the latitude that they have available. But when you think about the old 65mm and 70mm classics, Steve, like Ben-Hur, Gone with the Wind, Wizard of
Arabia,
Wizard Oz and Technicolor, films like these big tentpole films like those, which have been remastered quite recently. I mean, a lot of them have gone through 8K remasters. The 70mm stuff anyway has, and the latitude's there for them to do HDR versions. I know that the HDR versions are being done because Mike Soa, who we spoke to a couple of times in the past year, who works for Technicolor and whose main role has been advising on HDR and grading for HDR. So we know that the older stuff, like Wizard of Oz and stuff, will eventually come, and it will look spectacular. The only thing is, in HD you can see the matte paintings, and bits and pieces that you probably weren't supposed to see, given that it was shot on film, and then five generations down the line in a theatre, you wouldn't see these things. You are going to see them, because even with the HD versions of like the Wizard of Oz, you can see the matte painting quite clearly.
Well, not even a matte painting, it's actually a painting, isn't it, at the end of the set, where the Red Yellow Brick Road continues on, and it's quite clearly that. But it's interesting how, just quickly, do you remember the old urban myth about one of the Munchkins hanging themselves in the background of Wizard of Oz? Where that came from was people watching The Wizard of Oz on TV or on VHS, and in this blurry background, you could see something dangling from a tree, and it became this myth that one of the Munchkins had hanged themselves, or someone had committed suicide during this shot, which obviously was ridiculous. As soon as the HD version came out, you realised it was a crane, as in a bird, and it's quite clearly that. In HD, but you just couldn't see it in a blurry old VHS copy. And obviously, like you said, Phil, the wires that hold the monkeys up and that kind of stuff are visible in HD. But that's just part of the magic and charm of the original film.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it doesn't detract from it. I mean, it goes back to the olden days where, you had a certain black level on TVs and so on back then, and you had a certain gamma because there was actually people dressed in black holding sets up and that kind of thing. And when it was transmitted and you were getting the image on the TV, you couldn't see them because of the black level, because of the gamma setting. But they were there, holding sets up. And
it's interesting that the most common comment I've heard recently from filmmakers about HDR is that they keep saying that when the director or the director of photography is watching the new HDR transfer, they're saying, I'm seeing detail on this image that I haven't seen since I stood on the set and filmed it. That stuff that I saw with my eye, I'm now seeing on the film, which wasn't there. I'd never seen before. And that's interesting and quite exciting from our perspective.
So
fans.
Just to wrap up on the HDR thing, we did get to see 4000 nit HDR courtesy of Sony with their concept TV. Now, 4000 nits, it sounds extremely bright, and it would be if it was the full screen at that brightness, but obviously that's not what we're talking about. You're talking about the highlights. And the footage that they were showing was really quite pertinent because we were in Vegas. They were showing a slow helicopter ride along the strip with all the neon lighting and all the rest of it from the hotels, and then obviously black cars running down the road and so on. And the amount of detail that you could see, it was like, and again, I don't want to hype this, I don't want it to sound like marketing, but it really was like you were there on the strip looking at it with your own eyes. Because of the and you'll know what I'm talking about, because if you look at something with your own eyes at night, you see loads of detail in the black areas, you see loads of details in the shadows, and when you have bright objects, you can also see detail within the bright objects. So if you're standing on the strip looking at it with your own eyes, you see all of this, and you're able to make out the bright lights against the really dark stuff, but still be able to see detail in the dark stuff. That is what it was like.
They were showing a clip from Annie as well, the new film version of Annie, and they were in a helicopter, and there was sunlight streaming through one of the windows of the helicopter and hitting the chair, the seats behind one of the characters, and the reflection of the light, it looked like real life. It looked the way that sun would reflect off of something if you were looking at it, if you were sitting in the helicopter with them.
Yeah, none of this blowing out yellow, dirty look to stuff. Yeah. It was actually there. The detail was actually there, and the highlight for me was. It was a car, a well-polished old car that was sitting in a hotel under the canopy of the hotel, and the canopy had loads of lighting, LED lights and so on, and that was reflecting on the car. And the detail was just stunning. The brightness level of the lights against this car body, yet you were still able to see that it was a car, and the details of the bodywork and so on, and it's in one of our videos, that clip, as well as the clip on the strip, and you won't be able to see it on the video in terms of the sheer brightness and so on, and the realism. But I'll give you an idea of the clips that we're actually talking about here, and it was stunning to see, and it was stunning to see because, and I think this is a major point to make, Steve, it was comfortable to watch. We were watching it in dark surroundings, and it was comfortable to watch. It wasn't tiring. It wasn't that bright that you were having to turn away, unless there was something deliberately done in the image to make you feel like that, as we said earlier on with the explosions. That intensity of the explosion is there to make you wince, to make you move away, because it's telling the story and it's part of the narrative. On clips like this, where it was just about bringing out details and so on, it was comfortable to watch. Yeah, the brightness was there to actually bring the detail out. And another clip that was used everywhere was Mad Max, and the cars across the desert, and the fire coming out at the ends of guitars and stuff like that. And even though it was CG, it still looked incredibly realistic. The way the fire was coming out the end of these things, and the brightness coming from it. And again, it was comfortable to view, but it was dramatic and it was in your face.
Yeah, it was. I'd seen Mad Max Fury Road at the cinema. I've seen it at home. on Blu-ray, and looking at those demo, I mean, there was the same scene. We saw it a lot, about 50 times. I think I saw that scene over and over again. But there were details in there that I wasn't aware of the first time or second time I'd seen it. So it really was bringing out detail in a way that I think is going to really revolutionise how we look at film and TV content going forward. It's exciting. I mean, from that perspective, the show was really exciting. The kind of potential now, as a film enthusiast, for the experience you're going to have at home. Possibly, you could say you're going to be getting an experience at home that's as good as, and in some respects, better than at the cinema currently, which is exciting if you're a film fan.
And if you're a sports fan, we also, on the Dolby Vision demo stand, we were showing various things, but we were also showing a rugby match, which was shot in a stadium where half of the pitch was in bright sunshine and half of the pitch was in shadow caused by the stadium and the angle of the sun. Now, this is a common thing when you watch Premiership football on Sky or BT or BBC. It's one of these issues, and if you're a camera operator, what normally happens is you have the camera operator who's operating the camera. You then have another person who is manually moving focus, but also the iris, and opening the iris up and down depending on the light. So if the ball moves into the dark section, they open it up so you get more brightness through the camera so you can see what's going on, and when it goes in the bright section, they close it down. So there's someone sitting there doing that all the time. When you're watching the broadcast, and cameras are set up for different areas of the pitch and so on. What HDR allows them to do is to basically open up the iris and leave it open, and all the processing is done via HDR, via the broadcast truck, and then output. And the difference between the shadow, the dark shadow, and the brightest areas is like you sitting in the stadium looking at the same action on the pitch. And it was absolutely astounding to see it that way. And there was no washout, because the first thing that would hit me was if you've got it open all the time and you've got the darker area, the darker area is going to be washed out so it matches the lighter area. Not so. There was still a huge dynamic range there in the image, wasn't there, Steve, between the dark area, the shadow detail, and the light area. And the light area wasn't blown out. It wasn't, there was still detail in the rugby uniforms, tops, and there was still detail in the stands. You could still see people in the stands. It was really, really impressive stuff.
It is sounding like a real revolution now, isn't it? I mean, I've had a little taste of it, but I'm genuinely far more excited about this than I was 4K and 3D for sure. So
I mean, this year's show, because people have got their act together, Mark, as well, and we're now moving towards having at least two standards, and there's not going to be any issues with the two standards because Dolby Vision is an add-on, so you're always going to have HDR10 in whatever you do, and then you're going to have these little add-ons. So Dolby's definitely going to have that add-on, and you maybe see one other, but again, it'll be an add-on to the system. The HDR10 will be the baseline for everybody, and the only thing, like we say, is broadcast, but broadcast will fall into line with everything else. The last thing that the industry wants is for stuff to be incompatible, and I think that was a really heartwarming thing to take away from an industry that's basically capitalist and want to get out there and make as much money as possible. I think they genuinely realised that everything has to talk to everything else, and the last thing that they want is consumers phoning their helpline saying this doesn't work, that doesn't work. And I think they've genuinely, especially the BDA as well, Steve, they've gone to great lengths to make sure that if it's incompatible, it won't play. You're never going to have a bad experience with it. You might get a message that says you can't watch this because your equipment's not up to snuff, but you're never going to be given a really bad experience with it. So as an early adopter, we've had issues recently with projectors and that kind of thing, not being able to play HDR clips and so on. That's what you get as part of early adoption, as part of what we do. You're going to get this thing and it's going to look like it's a mess. The thing I got from this show, Steve, and you can back me up on this, is that we're not likely to see that going forward. We're more likely to see things that say this won't play because you don't have the equipment, please play this other version or whatever, and you're never going to be given a bad experience.
No, I mean, and it looks as though the BDA have gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that people receive as higher quality performance as possible within the limitations of their display, basically. So either it will map the content to your display, as given the native performance of the display, or in the worst case scenario, it won't play at all. But you won't get a diminished performance, and you certainly won't get a washed out picture or something like that. They've really gone to extreme lengths to ensure that's the case, which I think is very sensible, because nothing would kill a format faster than having a crap picture. But also, I'm really pleased that the UHD Alliance has got together all the manufacturers, all the studios, everybody, the streamers, the lot, and agreed on a set of basic standards for what they would class as a premium UHD experience. And you could say, well, why didn't they do that earlier? But it takes a long time for this kind of thing to happen. We're talking about lots of different companies getting together, sitting on committees, deciding on a set of standards and basic specifications, and it takes time to do that. And they obviously started doing it this time last year. Now they've got a basic setup for certainly for Blu-ray and for streaming content and TVs, and they're looking at adding more specs for broadcast and for things like projectors. So that's great. And some people will moan and say, well, my TV I bought 2 years ago doesn't. Well, okay, fine, but unfortunately, that's the basic downside of buying on the bleeding edge, isn't it? If you're going to buy, be a first early adopter on new technology, things change, and that's just the nature of it. And I know it's not always nice to know that fact, but it is a fact. And all I can say is that going forward, from this year onwards, if you buy a TV that's got a premium UHD badge on it from the UHD Alliance, it will definitely have at least 70% of DCI. It will definitely be Ultra HD, obviously. It will support HDR in some form, at the very least HDR10. And it'll be a 10-bit, so you're going to get that kind of performance, and I think that's encouraging. Again, that instead of all arguing with each other and producing different things, they've sat down and they've thought about it and agreed on a basic set of standards. And it's nice to see the manufacturers and their studios, being sensible for a change.
And the real thing I took from it is that they're not just settling for a level of performance that they can all reach right now.
No,
they've actually set the bar quite high. In fact, I would say, looking at the industry and the way things were just 6 months ago, they've set the bar incredibly high to be able to get this certification. But that's what I think that's what's needed. Make it more difficult for people to reach, because then it has a bit more value when you reach. When a product reaches that point, it has a bit more value because it is guaranteed to work in a certain way.
Yeah, it makes you realise it's not just a marketing tool.
Yeah,
and there is
exactly.
some value to this actual certification program. Obviously it is about marketing as well, but by setting those bars quite high, 1,000 nits for an LCD television, LED LCD, that's basically only just starting to be achieved this year. So that's really cutting edge stuff.
I guess we could be cynical here and say, well, they had to do it because there's two competing technologies on the market. But it's nice to see that they've gone for the higher dynamic range displays as well, like OLED, which has a lower starting floor when it comes to black levels. And yes, the highlights can't go as bright as an LED TV, but you have vastly superior dynamic range to start with. So it doesn't need to go that much brighter. And it's nice to see that the standards take that into account as well.
It is, and for those that are curious, we've seen HDR content on the new LG OLEDs, and it looked absolutely stunning in terms of those incredibly deep blacks, but also bright highlights. Not 1,000, it's only 500 nits, but I don't think you're going to notice much of a difference between 1,000 and 500 necessarily. Because,
like we were saying, it's about the spectral highlights of the film. It's about the tiny little highlights. So the difference between the 500 nits and the 1,000 nits isn't that great when it comes to what you're actually watching. We're not talking about the whole panel brightness here, which is, I think, confuses people. And I think if you have that mindset, that's why it could appear that 1,000 nits is so much brighter than 500. Well, actually, when you're talking about how the material is and what it is that you're actually seeing within the material, it's like the old resolution game, 4K against 1080 at a certain viewing distance. There's not that great a difference. And the same here, 500 nits to 1,000 nits, because you already got that fantastic dynamic range in the OLED compared to the LED LCD. There's not a great deal of difference when it comes to the brightness.
You're right. It'll adjust to the black of the OLED, won't it? So the bright will seem to just as bright.
Exactly.
Conceptually.
Exactly. So unless you got them sitting side by side in a room with ambient light, that's not going to play too well to the OLED's plus points. But that's always going to be the case with the OLED, because the OLED is better suited to darker environments because of the dynamic range. It's like a JVC projector against a BenQ DLP. You know, shove them in a living room with white walls, white ceiling, and so on. There's not going to be that much difference between the two. Shove them in a Batcave or in the right environment for the JVC's dynamic range, and suddenly it's night and day difference. And it's the same with OLED against LED, although not to the same extent. There is the differences there. But like you say, I mean, because you got the higher dynamic range of the OLED, the fact that it's 500 nits versus 1000 nits isn't a huge point.
No,
I wouldn't have thought so at all.
Okay, so let's leave HDR there. I think we've gone over it, and it's something we're going to talk about every week on the podcast, so let's not overdo it on the first podcast of the year. But certainly that's our highlights. That's what we've taken away from the show. It's exciting stuff, it really is. And, you know, I'm excited for the year. I'm excited to see what we're going to get in for review and how things are going to work. Now, another thing that really excited me, piqued my interest when the news came through, you know, being an old school DJ back in the day where I used to have my Technics SL1200s or SL1210s if you were into the black ones. Lovely to see Technics come back. I don't think we were expecting this actually. We were expecting a more sort of high-end hi-fi turntable to appear, Ed. That's the way everything was progressing. At IFA we were showing basically a slab of metal, which looked very much like an SL10.
Yeah,
to be honest.
SP10.
SP10, so yeah. And that's what we were expecting to be announced by Technics, and then we got the SL1200 coming back. It looks beautiful, as it always did. It's based on the Mark. I think it got to Mark 5 or Mark 6 before it was discontinued. So it's based on the newest, oldest model, if you catch my drift. $4,000 price tag added to it. Now this is a turntable that used to sell for 320 quid. When it was in mass production. It's no longer in mass production. This is not going to be a mass-produced line that come out. It's going to be quite limited, actually. But 4,000 is still a huge amount of money, even though they have made a lot of advancements. I'm sure you've read up on the press release and stuff now, Ed, and you know the different things that they have put in there, such as dampening to help with the direct drive motor. The top of the plate's also brass to help with the big rubber mat that goes on the top in terms of keeping noise out of the chain and so on. So they have actually made quite a few advancements to make it a more audiophile performer.
They have, but then I don't know. They've tried to please everybody, and I don't 100% know who actually the end result is going to please. What you say there is entirely correct. It's almost like they've taken a number of bits from the old SP10, which wasn't a DJ deck. It was strictly a home audio and studio based product, and it only span at 2 speeds, didn't have pitch control or anything like that. So it's got aspects of SP10 added, but then the problem is it still looks like an SL1200. Now, for every person that likes that, there's another person that's going to go, it's a bit. It's actually a weird combination of looking a bit flash and a bit cheap at the same time. And then the most baffling bit is that the SP10 was always sold without arm. In fact, it was sold without plinth. You just basically got the deck assembly and you stuck it in the plinth of your choice, and then chose the arm to suit. This is mainly because Technics, you know, the arm on the SL1200 is perfectly secure for what it did and what it was required to do, but it was never a particularly hi-fi piece of equipment, in so much as it gets replaced anytime someone tries to hi-fi up an existing one. That's the first thing that gets chopped in.
Yeah.
And here you are with, you know, what is fundamentally okay. They've beefed up bits of the deck quite impressively, but it's, you know, there've been some detail improvements to the arm, but it's nothing to get particularly excited about, and they want $4,000 for it.
Yeah, you see, this is what rankled on me. Was I understand the fact they no longer have their production line. It was mothballed a long time ago, and it would cost so much money to get that up and running again that it's just never going to be. It's never going to be a mass-produced product. So you got to understand that it is going to cost a little bit more for them to bring this back. But I'm like you. I'm really mixed with it, Ed, because I wanted it back because of the looks. Because I basically wanted one to put on my shelf, just for old time's sake. You know, I've always loved the way it looks. And for me, that's why I would want one. I would use it as a deck, but not as an audiophile deck. You know what I mean? It'd sit on there. It would look nice, and I'd occasionally put a bit of vinyl if I could find a bit of vinyl on it, and play a bit of vinyl now and again. That's what I would use it for. And I think the vast majority of people that would want to see the SL1200 come back are the people like me who are sentimental about the deck and would want it for a particular reason. Probably the same as me, put it on a shelf and admire it for what it is, which is a beautifully built piece of equipment from the 1970s. You know what I mean? And we've all got fond memories of using them professionally or as as a first turntable, whatever. And you're quite correct. A lot of people go out and buy SL1200s or SL1210s and then start doing them up to make them sound better, because you got a fantastic starting point there.
Yeah, I mean, there's companies that actually tear them to pieces and use their innards in what is ostensibly being then offered as their own product.
Yeah,
but this just doesn't fit it happily into either of those.
Exactly,
subsets.
it's too much of a mixture. It's too much of a trying to please everybody and not being particularly good at either, because it's overpriced for what it is. And now we understand it's going to be hefty on the price tag. I would still think it would be expensive at 1,000.
I could have got away with 4,000.
Yeah, 4,000 is just too much. And yeah, it's going to be a limited run. They're not going to sell them. You might get the odd person who £4,000 is not a lot of money to come along and think, yeah, I'll have one of those. But there's not many of those around. And those that are in audiophile circles already look at this turntable with disdain.
Well, no, don't get me wrong. Thankfully, some of the disdain towards direct drive as a concept has begun to be eroded over the years, and there's a degree of exceptions. If you throw a fair amount of money at the problem, you can do quite amazing things with the 1210. But this one ships costing a lot of money, and with perhaps its major problem still in place and attached to the side of it. So you're going to be asked to spend a lot of money, and then the first thing you really want to do if you want to achieve what the deck is truly capable of is rip a bit of it off, and that's a tall order. It just, I don't know. Something tells me that, having seen some of the things that people are prepared to buy in this ongoing analog revolution, within the limited aspirations they've got for it, they'll flog them, and it'll probably act as a useful halo product. I'm a little bit disappointed at the cynicism of it, especially, and I don't want to come across as unduly negative to Technics here. Their relaunched audio equipment it did quite bold things. It didn't just plough existing, it didn't go straight back to where they'd been in 1994.
No, they completely changed
new things and quite bold things. And then slap on top of this is a product that isn't bold at all.
Well, I think there is still another turntable on the way, Ed.
We've got to hope so.
Which is more audiophile, which is based on the SP10. I think that's coming. I think it's safe to assume that is coming. This is the Halo product. It's the one that everybody was clamouring for. When the Technics name came back, it was the most asked question. Panasonic did the research and it was there. It was the most. And the other thing was, we went to see it on the stand, and no word or lie, Ed, and Steve will back me up on this. While we were standing there talking to the guy on the stand, I lost count of how many people came up with big smiles on their faces, taking photographs of this turntable. There was other audio product there. They weren't interested in it. They wanted to see the turntable and take photographs of it, and they all had big grins on their faces, and everybody said it's great to see it back. So
it was quite surreal that one of the biggest announcements at CES 2016 was a turntable.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I mean, actually, if you look through the releases, I mean, as you've pointed out, Sony's announcements in the field of video were timid with it. Well, it wouldn't have a capital T because that would have been a bit bold. They were seriously timid. But then at the same time, somebody somewhere has been beavering away in a darkened room, producing a turntable which appears to share no components with any OEM product hitherto seen, that has the ability to rip to DSD. So again, 2016, and well, I mean, that's actually the most bizarre combination of things that people are obsessed with at the moment to possibly be embodied in one product. But yeah, all of a sudden, it's back. I'm increasingly concerned, if I'm honest. I think this has we have all the hallmarks of being teetering on the edge of a massive implosion in interest in vinyl. It only needs a couple of little factors here and there to coincide.
I don't know, Ed. I don't know, Ed, because for the first time in probably about 20 years, I was in a consumer electronics show, not a show, in a store that had a full aisle, and I'm talking a massive aisle, of vinyl records.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen that in 20 odd years. I mean, it was a surreal experience, flicking through albums on racks on this huge area of the store. And we're not, you're talking about, how long would you say those racks were? About 30 yards, Steve?
Yeah, something like that. It was it looked like the kind of stuff you would have seen back in the day, mid-80s.
Back in the old HMV days, and everything was in box sets as well. It was the first time I've seen box sets in years of new albums, but really nicely packaged and all the rest of it. It was quite a surreal experience, Ed. And then just along from there was another 30-yard aisle of turntables. And funnily enough, we went up to the Audio-Technica one, which looks identical to an SL1200, and it was $250. So if you want the look of the old SL1200 or SL1210, go and get the Audio-Technica, because it looks identical.
Well, there is that, isn't there? I mean, I think this is a conversation for another time. Actually, I need to speak to you about possibly doing a column about this. But my concern is now the actual home experience of the smartphone and solid state generation living with their fad purchase, how that's going to pan out long term. And yeah, I wait with bated breath. I have some concerns. I'm not going to lie.
The likelihood is that we're going to be talking about CES for probably the next 2 or 3 podcasts, so we're not going to get it all covered today, and we've been going quite some time already. I think the major things that we needed to get out of the way are the stuff that we've discussed in the podcast this week, and I guess just to wrap up for this week, and like I say, we'll continue the conversation in the weeks to come as we start to see product starting to appear, because we got who have we got? February starts with the main events, isn't it, Steve? So we got Sony's announcement for the UK market coming up 2nd of February. There's a couple of others. Philips are going to, TP Vision Philips are going to announce their European lineup in February as well. We've got Panasonic Convention in February, where we're going to get to see their lineup for and there is a lineup coming. Don't panic about what we were saying earlier on about the US market.
Full lineup, don't worry.
There is a full lineup coming for
and we'll
Europe.
Also at some point in February I expect to have some sort of event from LG.
Yeah, there's normally
Samsung
that.
as well.
Yeah, Samsung usually have their thing as well. So we're going to get more in detail, in depth look at the product lines that are coming in February.
Sorry, Phil, just one thing, because one of the interesting things about CES this year was in terms of actually seeing TVs for this year from all the manufacturers. I mean, there was very little actual. So for example, on the LG stand, they had the G6 and the E6, but they didn't have the C6 or the B6 on show, so we didn't get a chance to see those. Samsung didn't have on the actual stand. They only had a couple of models again. We did see some more. That was actually a dealer demonstration, and Sony only had and they've changed the naming convention slightly, but it's the XD94 and XD90C on show.
They've changed the way they do the models.
It was a bit of a disappointment actually, because basically it looks like they're the same TVs as last year, but without the big speakers and a slightly different name.
Yeah, that was the disappointing thing. I mean, they had a fantastic Halo demo with that 4000 nit HDR, and then everything else was much of a muchness. Now, that's not to say that in any way that the design's not nice, because it is a beautiful looking TV, isn't it, Steve? I mean, the way they've got the gold running through the stand, and the thin design of the main bezel, with the gold running through the middle of it.
Very nice TV. And I think most
really
people
nice.
would probably applaud them for taking the big speakers off. I appreciate they were trying to make them sound better, but the fact is, if you're buying a big 65-inch or 75-inch TV, you've almost certainly got your own sound solution anyway.
But what annoyed me was they wouldn't give us any details as to the colour space that they were using. They would not divulge what their peak brightness was for HDR, highlight brightness was for HDR. They weren't given any technical details.
No, and they aren't premium UHD certified by the UHD Alliance. Now, they said they didn't want to do that because they didn't want to confuse the message on their TVs with their own branding, etc.
Yeah.
But the fact that they wouldn't give us the numbers suggests that they weren't certified because they wouldn't have hit the standards in the first place.
Yeah, which, again, we come back to them having a really high bar, a really high standard to achieve certification, which we applaud them for, because yes, if you bought a TV in 2014 or 2015, no, it doesn't reach the standards for certification, and unfortunately, you have bit the bullet for investing in new technology as an early adopter, and these things happen. But the positive thing is that this bar is raised high, and any product going forward that is certified does reach a certain level of performance and certain numbers, and you can be guaranteed that it's going to do certain things as well, which this industry really needs. The marketplace really needs that kind of thing, because it dispels the marketing straight away, doesn't it? It reaches, and it's what THX tried to do a long time ago, and were quite successful for a certain amount of time in the late 80s and through the 90s in saying that a product that had their badge reached a certain level, well, that's Premium UHD Alliance badge. It means that the product reaches a certain level, and the bar is set quite high, which we've got to applaud them for.
It's also more transparent than THX because you've got actual numbers and things.
Exactly, yeah. You got to remember THX was a business, whereas the UHD Alliance is the entire business all in one, and it's in their interests to be as transparent as possible. So again, we've got to salute them on that as well. Let's not forget, this is a business, people have to make money and all the rest of it, and we are perfectly right in having our cynical hats on, and I'm sure our listeners are the same. We all have our cynical hats on, we all know what's hype and what's market and so on, but genuinely coming out of this show, I'm really impressed with the UHDA. We had a closed door meeting with them. They were really upbeat about how things are going. They've gone from having 3 members to 35 members.
Yeah, it's pretty much.
So
looking at the membership list, everyone you could think of, really. I couldn't see any obvious missing names on that list at all.
Even THX is in there, and they're supposed to be competitors, if they're certifying things, and even they are working together. So, yeah, got to applaud them for that. It's not every day that this industry gets together and does anything positive, and you're always going to have your companies like Sony that want to do their own thing, but the fact that everybody, they're on the list, by the way, but the fact that everybody is tending to come together under this umbrella is a positive thing. Right, so very quickly, just to wrap up this week, because we are over time, and like I say, we're going to be discussing this for the next few weeks coming ahead anyway. So favourite products at CES. Now let's go to the guys on the outside who aren't on the show floor. So Ed, the one announcement, the one big product that was your favourite.
To be honest, actually, I know I'm supposed to say something hi-fi, but I wait with interest to see the pricing on is it the B65 or B55 LG OLED, the flat one?
B6.
B6. Sorry.
That's yeah.
With the flat one, hopefully, at a price point that doesn't make me cry. It's good to see more models, and I my sympathies to people bemoaning the lack of 3D. Frankly, I couldn't give a monkey's. And yeah, that looks it's positive to see them doubling down, more products, more price points, and yeah, best of luck with that one. Okay, cool. Mark?
In a similar vein, but I'll go a bit higher. I'll go the signature OLED from LG with Dolby Vision and all that jazz, and sounds like it's got everything you need for some amazing viewing.
Cool. That was the interesting thing, though, Steve, wasn't it? The G6 and E6, very, very similar. In fact, same panel, but different standard design.
As far as I can work out, in terms of picture performance and panel, all those TVs are basically the same. The C6 is curved and the B6 doesn't have 3D. But aside from that, you're getting a same performance Dolby Vision on all of them, etc. And the differences are really more cosmetic. So speakers, speaker sound base basically is what they've got built in on the G6 and things like that. But in terms of picture performance, it looks like LG are offering a very similar experience across the product range for OLED, which I think is really good of them. That's impressive. My only slight complaint, and I sound churlish, but I wish they'd make a monitor version, without the speakers at all. A nice big 65-inch OLED, flat OLED. Again, almost all flat too, wasn't it, Phil? In fact, pretty much everywhere these days. This time was it was still some curving going on at Samsung stand, but pretty much everywhere else it was flat.
But it wasn't all curved on Samsung stand, which I found surprising. That was probably my biggest surprise of the show was when we had a quick look around the dealer hall with all the models lined up. that was a surprising thing. It was about a 50-50 split when it came to the Samsung lineup between flat and curved. So it just shows you that the market has spoken, and not all of the market wants curved TVs.
Yeah. So LG, fantastic OLED, awesome, very impressive. Wouldn't mind a big monitor version there without the speakers, and maybe to get the price down a bit, but still get the big image experience. But my personal product of the show was going to be UHD Blu-ray. Finally seeing it there for real with actual players and actual discs was great news.
Okay. Is that your favourite product?
I'm going to go single product. I would pick the E6.
Okay, I'd pick the G6 just because I quite like the way that it goes from use on a stand to use on the wall with that sound. By the way, just engineering wise, that's fantastic how they managed to do that on such a slim screen as well with that weight. Looks really quite impressive. That biggest surprises, I think we've gone through that as well. Biggest disappointments, for the first time at CES, I wasn't that disappointed with stuff. I saw that many great innovations and good quality demos that I didn't really come out of the show feeling disappointed about anything really that I can think of. You, Steve?
Disappointed with their TV lineup. I thought it was more of the same from last year, really, and disappointed that they didn't do a UHD Blu-ray player. Very disappointed about that.
Yeah,
and also in that case, disappointed a little bit. LG didn't do one either, although.
Well, I mean, they've already said, look, it's a big investment. We'll see how the market goes. And
fair enough, but LG, given that Sony created Blu-ray, I thought they would at least, and they've got a film studio and everything. You thought they'd push it, but anyway.
I wouldn't say it was a disappointment. I more expect that from Sony these days. Sony, they haven't been trying for a number of years now, in my opinion. This is my personal opinion. So I really wasn't that surprised with that, Steve. They seem to be treading water. Maybe it's a case of they just have to get that division making money again before.
They're just streamlining. I mean, Kaz, I was pointing that out at length during the conference, how he streamlined the company and got them more profitable. So I think that's what that's all about, really.
And that makes sense. If that's the issue, then it makes sense. You'd rather they were making money before they then try and do anything, that's going to put them back in the position that they clearly were, which was losing money hand over fist, basically, in their TV department. So if they're managing to get that to pay, and that's no easy task when you look at the US market, like we discussed at the beginning of the podcast, I guess that's understandable. Product of the show. I think I'm going to say HDR.
I was going to say that as well.
That was the product of the show.
Well, you can save time. You're in perfect agreement.
So there we go. On that bombshell. Is it a bombshell? I don't know. Like I say, we're going to keep coming back to this over the next few weeks, and we've got the products being launched within the next month as well, or certainly being announced within the next month. So we'll see what the UK lineup's going to be as well, and we should get our first sort of hands-on in the next few weeks as well. So all exciting stuff, but we're going to have to end for this week because we're way over time, and Mark needs to go and pick up the kids from school.
And it's raining, and they'll cry.
Right, so my thanks to Mark Hodgkinson.
Put the bunny back in the box.
Ed Selley.
If you can't trust a South American drug lord, who can you trust?
And Steve Withers.
Define irony. Bunch of idiots dancing on a plane to a song made famous by a band that died in a plane crash.
Don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook, bookmark AVForums for latest reviews, news and video, and of course you can leave us a rating on iTunes. If you give us 5 stars, we'll read your name out on the podcast. Can't say fairer than that. I'm Phil Hinton, thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you again next week.